The Mighty Miss Malone, Chapter 28, The New Turned Leaf. Mother's favorite saying is, "Where there's a will, there's a way." And my will was strong enough to find a way to write her a note, borrow money out of the filing cabinet, buy a Greyhound bus ticket, and come to Detroit, all by myself. It was 10 o'clock at night, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't in bed asleep. Instead, was squeezing my pocketbook to my chest, standing behind a tree in Detroit, Michigan. Across the street was the address that Mr. Z had said was the New Turned Leaf, a speakeasy, a nightclub. I kept peeking at the house trying to figure it out. I know you can't read what someone's like by the way they look. The person who seems to be kind and understanding may be using that look to hide something horrible, while the person who at first sight scares you might turn out to be the gentlest soul you'll ever meet. And things like houses hide their secrets even better than people do. Things don't even have to try. My heart sank. Nothing seemed to match up with the horrible rumors I've always heard about speakeasies. The minute I decided I was going to come to Detroit by myself, I'd been scared to death about what I'd see once I got to the New Turned Leaf. I thought there'd be all sort of loose grown-ups, half undressed, shouting and fighting. I thought there'd be drunken men laying in the mud next to a pile of people who'd been stabbed or shot or had drunk themselves to death the night before. I imagined having to cover my ears to block out the gut-wrenching wails of children who were crying to their mothers or fathers not to spend all the grocery money on whiskey and beer or dice. But if those things were going on in this place, you could have fooled me. The new turn leaf was about the most unexciting thing I could think of. It looked the same as any other nice house that rich people lived in. The curtains had both on both floors were drawn and were so thick that if there were lamps on inside, you'd never know. The front yard was tidy, with a strip of geraniums growing along the sidewalk. There wasn't even a sign that let you know that this was only the number 3121 lit up under a porch light. The only thing that made me think this was more than just a regular rich person's home was that in a few minutes I stood behind the tree. Four couples and three or four men by themselves walked through the gate and followed the sidewalk to disappear around the back of the house. The men were all wearing very fancy suits and hats and ties. Mr. Marvelous Marvin would have fit in there here. The women were in some of the most beautiful dresses and shoes I'd ever seen. A lot of Sunday going to church hats had escaped from their boxes a couple of days early. I was so glad I was wearing my blue gingham jumper. I'd stick out like a roach floating in buttermilk in my other dress. One or two of the men were walking in their rooster strutting way that Jimmy and his hoodlum friends did back home in Gary. Everybody nodded or shook hands with the short, thick man, half hidden in shadows, leaning against the side of the house. I got the feeling he wasn't about to just let any old body go past him without some kind of trouble, even a scared looking girl dressed in very nice blue gingham. The curtains in one of the windows came apart, and a triangle of light shone through the darkness. A tiny head. It looked like a 5 or 6-year-old girl's was at the base of the triangle of light, and a pair of eyes locked right on me. She must have seen me watching as long as I'd been watching the house. She raised her hand to wave, then jerked her head around to look back into the room. The curtains fell and smothered the light. I started walking to the corner so I could circle around the house, but hadn't gone 5 steps before my second brain started filling my head with its usual nonsense. Well, kiddo, what if that child is a prisoner in the speakeasy? What if the little girl was getting ready to signal you to call the police when one of the murderers or drinkers or thieves or gamblers who were holding her prisoner came back into the room to make sure she hadn't escaped? What then? Concentrate, Deza. I kept walking toward the corner. My heart started pounding once I turned down the alley. Maybe Jimmy wasn't there after all. Maybe he was traveling, and maybe I could give up and go back to Flint. I kept walking past the speakeasy, cutting my eyes at it so if someone was watching, they'd think I was just a girl walking through a alley, not someone looking to find their brother or rescue a little girl who'd been kidnapped by gamblers. Then something made the doubts go away. A door on the side of the house that didn't have any kind of knob on it opened and a man came out. He only took a few steps, then dropped to his hands and knees. 2 times his back bucked up like one of the rodeo horses in the movies. He started throwing up more junk than you'd think a human could ever have swallowed. And the best thing was, when he finally got up and started running on his tiptoes towards the front door, I saw that the door hadn't closed all the way behind him. Doors without knobs, people coming out to throw up, guards hiding in the shadows, little girls held prisoner upstairs. When you add everything up, this was a for sure speakeasy. I watched the man on tiptoes until he turned the corner. Once he disappeared, I held my breath and slowly walked to the door. I put my ear near the crack. No screaming or loud noises. I put my fingers in the door and pulled it open so I could peek in. My head started spinning, and I didn't know if it was from relief or disappointment. There was nothing but a narrow hallway. A bright light bulb hung from a wire, and there was another closed door at the other end. This one had a knob on it. I stepped into the new turned leaf and shut the door behind me. I walked to the second floor, and without thinking what might be on the other side, I grabbed the knob, turned, and pushed at the door. It didn't budge. I leaned my shoulder into it and pushed really hard. It came open a crack. I put all my weight into the next push, and the heavy door moved far enough for me to stick my head through. For the second time that night, my head started spinning, but this time it had a good reason. Chapter 29. The man in the beautiful two-tone shoes. It was like I'd rubbed the magic lamp of the 40 Thieves. A strong smoky smell slipped through the crack of the door. Hard adult laughs laced themselves up in the smoke and rolled out with it. I had to blink and wipe at my eyes as the cigarette smoke stung them. I saw 3 round tables in a large dark room. Each table had 6 chairs set around it. There was a candle in a glass jar in the middle of the tables. A woman turned to look in my direction. From the light of the hall, the light from the hall was drawing attention, so I stepped inside, closed the door, pressed my back against the wall, and slid to the left. The woman stopped looking, and I kept sliding until I came to a stack of chairs. I squeezed behind them so that I was hidden. My heart was slapping at my ribs, and I was having a hard time catching my breath. If my head felt any lighter, I was going to end up swooning behind this pile of chairs. I remembered what Jimmy had said once about being scared, that if you pretended you were watching what was going on through the telescope, you got a lot calmer. And take 3 of the deepest breaths you can. 3 is a magic number. And if you breathe deep 3 times, you ain't got no choice but relaxing. By the third breath, I had to smile. Even though I'd pulled 3 giant puffs of stinking, smoky air into me, it worked and I was a lot calmer. Now that my eyes were used to the dark, I peeked from behind the chairs to get a good look around the inside of the new turned leaf. It was more like a cave instead of a room. There must have been 10 other round tables full of people spread out across one half of the place. The other half of the room was empty for a bit. Then there was a piano, a set of drums, a giant fiddle, a beautiful, shining gold saxophone, and a microphone. Seeing the microphone gave me hope. Maybe, just maybe, Jimmy was singing here. I began noticing other things in the room. On one side was a swinging door with a round window, and each time the door swung open, kitchen sounds joined with the voices in the speakeasy. Women were going in and out. Mother would say their clothes were scandalous. Their skirts didn't seem to be much more than a couple of handkerchiefs sewn together. The skirts flapped and sparkled in the light. There was just a little to their blouses. Their shoulders and arms were bare like movie stars in Hollywood magazines. I nearly jumped out of my shoes when a loud boom came from the stage. Lights came on, and 4 men were sitting on the stage with instruments in their hands. My heart sank. No Jimmy. People started clapping, and a little cheer went up. The musicians started playing, and I was shocked. I'd heard music on the radio and in moving picture theaters before, but this was different. It was beautiful and warm and went right into my body. The man at the piano said into the microphone, "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us this evening in beautiful Detroit, Michigan." I guess all Michigan people are like my father. They seem to be very proud of where they're from. The loudest cheer came when the man said, "Detroit." People bounced their heads up and down and snapped their fingers and smiled like a whole herd of Cheshire cats. When the first song was done, the crowd whistled and clapped. The man said, "Thank you so much. And now, what you've all been waiting for, our featured vocalist." The people stood up and cheered and screamed and banged their hands on the table and stomped their feet and made the house shake. He said, "Originally from Lancaster, Pennsylvania." "Lancaster," I screamed, like the people did when they heard Detroit. A curtain split in the middle, and a man in a beautiful blue suit with a pair of two-tone blue shoes and a matching blue hat stood with his head bowed. His face was completely covered by the brim of the blue hat. He was holding on a microphone. I froze. Maybe this man was going to introduce Jimmy. The drum banged, the people cheered louder. The drum banged, and one more time, and the music stopped. The man kept his head down and raised the microphone to his mouth. He waited and waited. I stopped breathing. Then a clear, strong voice sang, more or less resigned to crying over Angela. The band jumped in, the crowd screamed louder, and found out for a fact that I'm not a swooner. Because if there was anything in the world that would make you swoon, it was the air of the new turned leaf, the music of the band, and the voice of the genuine, gentle, jumping giant, Jimmy Malone. He looked up from under the blue hat and sang, I watched my heart leave the station, the day she said we were no more. It was Jimmy in a suit. Jimmy sang two songs and the crowd never calmed down. I raised my hand, hoping he'd see me, but knowing it was impossible. I came out from behind the chairs. People were too busy staring at Jimmy to notice me. Maybe if I had to go to the front of the room. I was this close to Jimmy when the man who had been standing outside by the door stepped in front of me like a wall. How'd you get in here? Let's go. He left his gut wide open. I know it was wrong, but I twisted my hips and swung as hard as I could. My fist crumpled against him, and pain shot through my arm like a epiphany. He looked at me like I was a mosquito. He reached at me, and I screamed as loud as I could. People turned around us, jumped back like it was on fire. The band and Jimmy stopped and moved off the stage through the curtain. The other big square men were just like that, standing around me. The only sound was people's shoes as they shuffled to the door I'd snuck in through. I yelled, Jimmy. The first man lifted me like I was light as a pillow. Jimmy! Through the microphone, I heard, Sis? The curtain opened and Jimmy stood there without his hat. Fellas, hold on, that's my sister. He said, Folks, please, please have a seat. We'll start the show in a minute. Please don't go. The man I'd slugged put me down as Jimmy jumped off the stage and grabbed me. We cried and cried. Aw, sis, so good to see you. I said, Jimmy, I've missed you so much. He walked me onto the stage and through the curtain to a stool. Let me take care of my business, Deza. Sit here till I'm done. The band started up, and it looked like they weren't ever going to stop. 4 times after they finished playing and stood up, people yelled and stomped until Jimmy did another song. When someone finally came and moved the drums and instruments off the stage, a white man smoking a cigar took Jimmy's hat and walked around the crowd. People started tossing in coins and even some folding money. Jimmy grabbed me. Come on, sis. I live just around the way. We've got a lot to catch up on. I see you're still the mighty Miss Malone. I can't believe you slugged Tito like that. Jimmy and me and the band went out the back door and got into a car just as marvelous as Marvin's. It wasn't a Buick, but it was great.